right, so now it is time to announce our award winners. This is the favorite part of my job. So the purpose of this award is to recognize outstanding scholarship in POS and to encourage research in this ever-growing field. Here is our criteria. The paper must address key issues or themes in POS, and it has to be empirical, can be from any disciplines, any research methods, but it has to be published or accepted for publication in the past 2 years prior to the deadline. Here are our selection committee members. 4 of us, including myself, served as a selection committee, and as I mentioned, we had a record number of nominations, 57, and it was a ton of work, I must say. So I would like to thank the committee members for reading through these papers with great excitement. Wayne Baker, Sarah Soderstrom, is she here today? Not yet. And Gretchen, thank you so much for serving as committee members. And I'll start with the honorable mentions. So we have 3 papers in this category, and when I announce them, could you please get up and give a standing ovation? I mean, you know, let's say it we deserve it, right? And just be careful because your chair might just like fold, and I don't want you to fall. And so just like keep that in mind that this is not your usual chair. And we all know how much sweat and tears go into the publication process. Get ready, doctoral students. So the first honorable mention goes to Rapid Relationality, How Peripheral Experts Build a Foundation for Influence with Line Managers, published in 2020 in Administrative Science Quarterly by Julia Di Benigno from Yale School of Management. Where's Julia? Please give her a standing ovation. Congratulations. Thank you. I love how long the standing ovation lasted. Be careful. All right, the second honorable mention goes to Swift Sense of Community, Resourcing Artifacts for Rapid Community Emergence in a Temporary Organization, published in Academy of Management Journal in 2021 by Luid Livne-Tarandash from Manhattan College and Huria Jazayeri from Santa Clara University. Please, congratulations. 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 Wow. Then the last and third honorable mention goes to Intersectionality in Intractable Dirty Work, How Mumbai Rag Pickers Make Meaning of Their Work and Lives, published in Academy of Management Journal in 2021 by Dean Shepherd at University of Notre Dame, Sally Maitlis from University of Oxford, Vinod Parida at Luleå University of Technology, Joachim Vincent, Henkin School of Economics and University of St. Gallen, Thomas Lawrence at University of Oxford. Congratulations. Congratulations for all 5 authors. I must say these were the most incredible and innovative set of papers this year. All right, so finally, let me announce the 2022 Award for Outstanding Published Article in POS, and the winner is Hope Cultures in Organizations, Tackling the Grand Challenge of Commercial Sexist Exploitation, published in Administrative Science Quarterly in 2021 by Katina Sawyer at University of Arizona and Judith Clair at Boston College. Congratulations. Please come up to the stage. Congratulations. All right. So this, I think it's on. Thank you for sitting. Here you go. And congratulations. I think this is for you. Congratulations. I am so happy to make this announcement. All right, so this paper was, please stay, yes. This paper was deeply impactful work that is theoretically meaningful and rich with practical implications. It also brings a sense of urgency in the literature to address grand challenges. So congratulations again, and please present and share your incredible research.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Awesome. Well, first of all, I just want to thank everyone for taking time to hear about our work this morning. We are incredibly grateful to be surrounded by so many inspiring people who we look up to. This is amazing. This is so special for me. I know it's special for Judy too. And we're just so happy to be here. So thank you. And to kick us off, since we're at the top of the program, I thought maybe I would set a little intention or our hope for the conference as individuals who believe in the power of positive organizational scholarship to change the world. I want all of us to focus over the course of the next couple of days on the ways in which the insights that we generate, the ideas that we generate, can be turned into actions that can create the world we want to see. There are so many looming challenges, from violence to climate change to poverty, that we have really good ideas about how to help solve. And I don't care if you're an assistant professor and an associate professor, full, emeritus, in some other profession, your ideas can make a difference. And so don't let anyone tell you that your ideas can't make a difference. They can. So I want us all to focus on how we can turn our ideas into actions that can drive the world that we want to see as an awesome group of people. So I'm excited to be here today. Thank you so much. So a little roadmap for our time together. So I'm going to kick things off by providing some context in which the research was presented. And then I'm going to turn it over to Judy to provide some of the literature that we grounded our investigation in. And then Judy's going to talk about the research questions and the methods that we use to respond to those research questions. And then I'm going to walk us through the results of the paper, and then I'll turn it back over to Judy to discuss some of the future research directions, things we've been thinking about in light of our findings. So let me tell you a little bit about the organization in which this data was collected. So I was initially a volunteer at Light for the Future. I did not embark on this project with the idea that it would be a research project. Indeed, I started off there as a volunteer and eventually realized that there were some really important stories that needed to be captured, both with regard to the residents and the staff. Initially, because Light for the Future is an organization that provides some employment-related services, and I'll get more into what they do in a second, I thought that that was going to be my focus. And actually, the data collection took an unanticipated trajectory, and hope ended up emerging as an important central construct. The work that Light for the Future does is incredibly important. They provide a shelter, which is a 1-year residential rehabilitational service program for women who have experienced an extreme form of gender-based violence called commercial sexual exploitation. And in their program, they provide free legal, social, psychological, medical, employment, and other services to help women who have experienced this extreme form of gender-based violence live more self-directed and self-fulfilling lives. And they live there for a year, which, as you'll see, actually ends up being quite a short period of time to overcome all of the challenges that they have. And so as I was watching them do this really important and interesting work, I thought that my focus was going to be on how did the residents transition into formal employment. And in fact, that is a really interesting story, but a story also emerged at the organizational level, which is one around how does this organization actually keep going in the face of the challenges that they're tackling every day. And so as that story was emerging, Judy informed me that actually what I was doing was an ethnography, which as a psychologist, I did not know. So when I found out that I was doing in ethnography. That was useful for me to kind of understand what I was doing in the context. But what I was noticing was that the real story and why I was drawn to sort of widen my scope was that this work was extremely difficult, ambitious, and emotionally taxing. And this is the precise reason why hope emerged as really important to the dynamics going on. So I want to tell you a little bit about the survivors of CSE that enter into Light for the Future. So when I entered into Light for the Future, I learned a lot about experiences that were very different from mine that really opened my eyes to the extreme trauma that these women were experiencing. So the average resident at Light for the Future has come from a background in which she has experienced extreme ongoing gender-based violence, usually over the course of her life, starting in childhood. Indeed, many of the residents at Light for the Future left violence-filled homes to try to make it on their own when they were teenagers. As they sought a life of financial and emotional stability, they actually ended up looking and turning to various social networks that they had access to. But on the streets, those networks are not always safe. And so often they turn to individuals like pimps who promise them that financial and emotional security. But in the case of these residents, those relationships often quickly soured, and they ended up being subject to even more abuse. As a result of the ongoing trauma that these residents experienced, they often developed comorbid symptoms of their trauma, things like drug and alcohol addiction, and really complex mental health challenges. So as the residents are coming into Light for the Future, this is what they're grappling with, right? How do we create a place for healing for trauma and a way to actually tackle this issue at a societal level? So even for those who are able to get out of what they call the entry, exit, re-entry cycle, which is a cycle that individuals who have experienced such trauma and are in CSE often experience, which is they want to leave, they try to leave, their trauma becomes overwhelming, doors are closing in front of them, and they end up re-entering back into the context. In this instance, right, even if individuals had gotten out of that cycle, once they entered into employment contexts or social circles in the real world or the regular world, right, they faced extreme stigma and they were very vulnerable because they didn't know how much they could share about their past. And so I want you all to just take a second to imagine. We're at Light for the Future. It's this beautiful house, airy, wonderful, windows are open, sunshine's pouring in, and a new resident walks in the door. And you begin to connect with this person and understand what it is that they need. And over time, you learn about all the traumatic experiences that they've had, the things that they've gone through. It's literally a miracle that they're even alive. You're trying to offer these services to help them. And over the course of the year, you see that they've made great progress. Like, they're doing awesome. And you're seeing them achieve goals that are self-fulfilling and self-directed. And then imagine one day after 9 months, you come in the door to find out that overnight that person disappeared from the program. No one knows where they are. You can't get in contact with them, and you never see that person again. This is what happens all the time at Light for the Future. And so, as you can see, this context is one that really calls for an intensive amount of hope. And I want you to sort of sit with that as we move forward into thinking about, and as I turn it over to Judy, as why our project took the trajectory it did.
Alrighty, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So I'm taking over from here, and as you may have remembered from what Katina said a minute ago, my job right now is to orient us in the literature and then also to tell you a little bit about the methods that we undertook for this study, some of which were novel, especially in terms of my relationship with Katina as these data were collected and we analyzed them and wrote up this paper. So as you probably already got the sense, Light for the Future is trying to tackle an extremely difficult problem, right? So you heard a lot about what it looked like on the ground, and you'll hear more about that in a minute from Katina. To work with women in Light for the Future, to be present in that organization. But if you zoom out, right, Light for the Future is trying to tackle a problem of commercial sexual exploitation, which is a worldwide problem that's been around for a very long time. and is involving multiple parties across national borders. And in addition to that, if you look at the literature on the experiences of people who try to get out of commercial sexual exploitation, what you'll find is that the majority of people don't make it, right? So this organization is tackling what the literature has come to talk about as a grand challenge, right? So grand challenges is kind of the first literature we began to orient toward as we started to become more aware of the complexity of the situation that Light for the Future was dealing with in their organization. So grand challenges are challenges such as theirs, highly complex, highly consequential, having existential implications for humanity and for the quality of life in the world, and also just filled with uncertainty about whether or not we can actually reach our goal. Light for the Future is not alone in their quest. There are many organizations around the world, many of which I'm sure you're familiar with, that are trying to tackle their own grand challenges. Whether it might be a grand challenge of climate change or the most recent COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of hospitals trying to tackle response to that, or in terms of biotech firms and scientists trying to find a cure, a virus response. So there has been an increasing interest in our field in grand challenges, and some research is starting to pop out around that topic, as well as in other disciplines. And what that research shows is really a focus on how do we do this? How do we keep going, right? And the research has really organized itself around this idea of collaborating and bringing parties together to coordinate a response, right? So the focus is really about organizing. And yet, what we were seeing when we were looking at Light for the Future was a lot of coordination and collaboration and hard work. But what we were also seeing was extreme emotions, both positive and negative, that were part of the story of how they were either driving themselves forward or feeling despair and feeling overwhelmed. And so we began to focus, as we were going through our data analysis, on this idea of the role that emotions play in grand challenges. And so the image came to mind as we were, so for those of you who are qualitative scholars in the room, you probably are following along with me, but for those of you who are not, qualitative research kind of comes in and out of the literature, right? So when you're analyzing your data, you're going in and out of the literature. So you're kind of getting that journey with me. So as we were analyzing the data, the image of Sisyphus came to mind, right? So Sisyphus was this Greek mythological individual who was cast out to the underworld. And for the rest of eternity, his focus in life was to be rolling a boulder up a hill only to have it roll back down again. And that's all he was doing for the rest of eternity, which sounds like a horrible situation to be in. But, you can imagine Sisyphus might be thinking about all the ways that he could come up with a method to have that boulder finally stay up at the top of that hill. And maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't, but chances are not, because we know he's going to keep doing that, right? So the grand challenge space, Light for the Future, other organizations are kind of like Sisyphus, right? The ball is being pushed up the hill, the boulder is being pushed up the hill, only to roll back down again, because setbacks and failures are just part of the story of what those organizations are trying to do. And if you can imagine, Sisyphus, right, is probably feeling a lot of emotions, hope that maybe at one point the boulder will stay at the top of the hill, and also probably a lot of frustration. So, the question that was driving this research really was, like, how do organizations keep going? And as Katina and I have already intimated, hope was popping out as an important part of the story. So of course then we turn to the hope literature. What does the hope literature tell us about hope? And so if you look at the literature on hope, You'll find that that literature is multidisciplinary. It's been around for a very long time. Most of it looks at the individual level of analysis. So how do you hope for something in your life that you really want to achieve or overcome? And in the oldest literature that we ran across, which is really being driven by philosophers, hope was actually seen as a flight of fancy, like something that just was a foolish thing to engage in. But the modern literature, much of which has been driven by Snyder's model, who's a psychologist, of hope, is driven by a very positive perspective on hope. Hope is a useful emotion in organizational life and in life in general. And his idea was that there are three components of hope. One is goals, goal setting. The second is finding pathways to move forward toward your goal. And the third is keeping that motivation going to reach your goals. So we also looked, because we saw that hope was actually a property of Light for the Future. It wasn't just a person hoping, although certainly there were people hoping. It was a collective property of this organization, of people hoping together. And so we looked into, to try to find, well, what does the hope literature have to say about this at the organizational level? What we found is that there is some writing, but it's much more sparse. And what we found in that literature was hope was considered a future-oriented and emotion-oriented quality of experiencing in organizations among a collective of individuals, and also that it was viewed as a methodological imperative to study hope as a collective property. So we thought we were on the right path, but we also didn't feel like we understood a ton about what it looked like at the organizational level. But what we were seeing at Light for the Future was that it wasn't just about hope being shared among people. Hope was a part and parcel of this organization. It was embedded in the organization's culture. So this is where we turn to the work on emotion cultures in organizations. Sigal Barsaid, the late Sigal Barsaid, and her colleagues and some other folks that have gotten organized around this space really look at culture, emotion, and the intersecting with culture, and the idea that a certain emotional tone, emotional focus can be embedded in organizational cultures. And so what we were finding is that hope was at the center of Light for the Future's culture, and it was part of the storyline for how they were moving forward and trying to tackle their grand challenge. But what we were also seeing was that in that organization, we often think about hope as a really great thing, but hope in this organization both propelled them forward, but it also was an Achilles heel at times. And so the story you're going to hear from Katina in a minute really is going to help lay that out for you. Okay, I'm now supposed to talk to you about methods. I'm going to keep methods really short because I know you want to hear the findings and what we focused on there. So you heard a little bit about Light for the Future in terms of the physical structure of Light for the Future, just a little bit more. It was this very bright space, really warm, loving house environment in a neighborhood that was kind of, I'm telling this for a reason, but in a neighborhood that was gang infested, a lot of drug activity going on outside of the house. And so Katina was the person in the field for this 2-year ethnography. I was outside, and so I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But over the course of Katina's data collection, she collected the primary focus of her data collection, which was field observations. She had over 150 hours of being in this organization, often volunteering while she was in this organization. She also interviewed the staff. So this was a very small organization, so while it looks like she only did 3 interviews with staff, that was 75% of the organization's staff. She also interviewed residents, and this is a big deal. Okay, so you've heard a little bit about these individuals that were at Light for the Future. Katina really established an amazing trust with a number of women who were in this household. There were 18 women who participated. She undertook 30 interviews because some of the women participated in more than one interview, and the original intention was for her to interview people repeatedly, but as you've already heard, a number of women disappeared back onto the street. They just were gone. And so she followed as many people as she could for as long as she could. So when we analyzed the data, we used kind of standard qualitative research methods that I'm not going to go into detail about, but I just want to talk to you about a couple of unique things that we did. So the first thing we did was create a chronology of the 2 years, right? What happened over the course of this organization's history? And then from that chronology, we then adopted what is called a narrative ethnographic approach. Because we were seeing a lot of how this organization was processing, the collective, the individuals in the organization were processing what was happening in this organization was things would happen, people would gather together, have lots of conversation, there would be this contagion of discussion and emotion running through this organization. And so narrative ethnography really has you focus on that, on this idea of the conversation and how the group is understanding its own experience. So I'm going to end my comments with just a quick check-in about our two roles. So Katina's in the field. I am outside the field. I stepped into the study about 6 months into your data collection, where Katina came up to me at a conference at the Academy, actually, and said, I want to meet you. I want to tell you about this study. Would you, I want to share this with you. And I'm like, whoa, that is so cool. And that's when I told her it was an ethnography. I'm like, that is so cool. I want to get involved with this study. And then I found out much later, like a year or two later, that she actually had been stalking me to try to get me to get on to the study. So it worked out perfectly. But in any case, it was, in terms of data collection, Katina would be in the space. We would then have meetings, repeated meetings, where we would talk through what was happening there. That would inform her field notes. And also, I stepped into a different kind of role, which is not a typical role for me in academic research, which is really as an emotional support person, because this was really hard work. So just as an illustration, a really tragic event happened in this organization, which Katina will tell you about in a minute. And Katina called me from her car. And she's like, this just happened. I don't know how to process this. This is so tragic. I don't know how to make sense of this. And we talked through it both in terms of kind of what was going to go into the research notes, into her field notes, but also talking her through the experience. And then she said, I think there's a drug deal going on next to me. I think I need to leave now. And so we're like, okay, let's get off the phone. And she drove away. Okay, so with all of that set up, hopefully I've given you enough context to understand both the methods as well as some of the research background. I'm going to turn over to Katina, and she's going to share with you our outcomes, our findings.
Hi, it's me again. What we found over the course of our analysis, and I'm going to start with an idea that we've already sort of emphasized, which is that a hope culture was emerging within the organization. And we took a look at, okay, well, what are the core components of that hope culture, and then how is that coming to life within the organization? We saw that happening in 3 different ways. The first was around this sense of, if we band together, we have the power to achieve our goals. And having this at a collective level is a little bit different than at an individual level, right? Because you have to have this shared energy towards something. And so what we found in the organization was that they created a lot of avenues for forming strong social bonds between residents and staff so that they really felt connected to one another and so that they could rally around kind of a common cause or goal, right? And so they did a lot of things within the organization that are listed here, but some of my favorites were being in the house when they were celebrating an achievement or a birthday or a particular milestone, right? They would, all the other residents would bake a cake for someone whose birthday it was, and it would always be their favorite flavor, and we would sing, and people would celebrate their milestones that they had made in the program at that time as well. And so there was a lot of opportunities for creating this feeling of we're all in it together, which helped when someone would start to go astray for the group to be able to pull them back in, right? They also, another core component of the hope culture was that they felt that they had the methods and practices necessary for achieving their goals. So the organization, while it sounds kind of like fluffy and everyone's hanging out, it was actually a very serious program informed by trauma-informed clinical therapy that was set up in phases. And those phases were intended to move residents from the life that they were just in. They're coming in off the street and all of a sudden they're in this organization, in this program, and how do they transition into this new lifestyle? So there were actually some pretty strict norms in the house and strict rules in the house. There was also a sense that residents could not create disruptions for other residents. So if one resident was continually making an environment that it was impossible for other people to heal, that needed to be dealt with. So there were some rewards put in place for following the phases and following the rules, and there were some consequences for not. And they felt that they had figured out sort of what are the methods and practices for bringing people towards the goal. And then, of course, there was this sense of a collectively desired future, which is this self-directed life for survivors of CSE that the organization deeply believed in, and that life could be full of personal and professional goal achievement. And they talked a lot about this with residents. They did vision boarding exercises a lot. Each resident had their own room, and so they would hang their vision board on their room door after they made it. So they had a lot about this collectively desired future, like we're all going towards this new life, and that was in some of their materials as well. And something that I think is important is that when people came in the door at the organization, they said, "Welcome home." And for a lot of the people who had not had homes, that was actually very meaningful. And so the idea was this is a start of a new life rooted in this new home that you have here. And eventually you'll grow wings and be able to fly from here, but this will always be your home, right? So these were the three pillars of the hope culture at Light for the Future. So this chronological timeline shows you kind of what the experience was like in gathering the data here. This is not meant for me to go through all of these events because there's no time for that. But what I want you to really take away from this is that when we started thinking about the role of hope in the organization, we thought similarly, like this is a positive emotion, we're going to understand how this unfolds. And what we found over time is that hoping is actually not a linear, straightforward process. Hoping is a process that has ups and downs. And so things started off pretty good. During phase 2, as I'll talk about, things started to decline and unravel slowly. And then a tragic event caused the organization to sort of bottom out on their hope. And then after that, there was sort of a refresh or an ability to rebound from that experience that set them back on the trajectory towards where they started. So I'm going to talk through each of the phases. So for each phase, I'm going to break this into 3 parts, and you'll get a sense of how the flow of each model is, and then I'll present the full model at the end for each phase. So we have a model here that's going to be presented in full for each phase that we uncovered. So each phase begins with a set of triggering events, something that the organization then had to pause and make sense of. In our first phase, this was the initial group of residents entered and realized success. And there were a couple of groups or cohorts of residents that had come through and actually achieved the goals. Something that's important to note is that these groups of early residents actually very much fit with the definition that you might think of if you saw a movie about human trafficking. So not to make light of at all, because their trauma was absolutely extreme and is very serious. These individuals came from a place where they had strong familial ties or family ties. Many of them had strong educational backgrounds. They had work experience. They had a normal that got disrupted by this period of extreme trauma. But for the organization, it was slightly easier for them to bring them back to normal when they had a normal. As you heard in the introduction, and as became true about most of the residents at Light for the Future, that normal was not actually something that most folks held in common. And so it became more challenging for them to adapt to the residents' needs over time. But in the beginning, everything was good, right? And so the hope culture is promising that we can do this if we band together and follow the methods and practices. And in fact, that's what was happening. So in shared spaces, everybody's like, this is amazing. We're doing great, right? Everyone's doing wonderful. Like, look at all these achievements that the residents are making. This is awesome. And so what we noticed was as people were telling these stories and this discourse was happening, these 2 sort of forms of narratives popped up. Hope-filled narratives, which were the dominant form of narrative within the organization at this time, and then proto-narratives, which at this time were like almost nothing. So those proto-narratives are narratives that counter the dominant narrative. People saying, well, hold on, maybe not, right? That's a proto-narrative, people having conversations that counter that narrative. So at this time, people were like, we can achieve a new life. We have the passion to achieve this mission. We can band together. We can do it. There was a little sense of, hey, do we know if we can do this in the long term? The organization was fairly new. Is this really sustainable? But mostly everyone was amped about what they were doing. There was hope the organization could do amazing things. The future was possible. And inspiration and excitement was permeating the organization. So as a result, when you walked in, it felt vital. It felt alive. People were smiling and happy and walking around and creating these positive connections with each other, right? And the organization at this time actually started to engage with a consultant to see if they could expand their program to other cities and towns. And there was also a lot of talk about patenting their method to say, well, this is really working, so we should tell other people how to do this so that, folks can heal from trauma in this way across the country or across the globe. So overall, we call this hopes running high because they were really energized and vital towards their goals and were in fact expanding what they thought they could do. Phase 2 tells a slightly different story. So in phase 2, increasing number of residents were having issues with getting through the program. I mentioned before that sometimes residents would disappear. That started happening within this phase. And particularly 2 residents disappeared from the program who had served as matriarchal figures in the house that were really role models in the house. And when they disappeared, it really shook the house. There was also a physical altercation that happened in the house during this phase where one resident attacked another resident, which resulted in a resident having to be kicked out of the program. And so there was a lot more turmoil going on than they had experienced before. However, some residents were still doing well. As a result, we see sort of this split ambivalent pattern within phase 2. So residents and staff were discussing these issues. There were still some hope-filled narratives that were happening, and that was happening in 2 ways. One was when positive things were happening, of course, but also when negative things were happening that could be made sense of in light of the hope culture's promises. So if someone relapsed and failed out of the program, or someone disappeared, or something, or had a problem in the house, if they hadn't bought into the hope culture, so they weren't banding together and being a good team player, they weren't following the methods and practices, they didn't seem to share the collective vision. So there's someone in the data that was kind of like, I'm here for my personal purposes because I'm waiting something out and I need somewhere to live, and then I'm bouncing, right? And so it was clear that she was not on board, right? So the idea is that when they hadn't bought in, they weren't exemplifying that hope culture, we could say, well, it wasn't us, right? It was just that they weren't hoping along with us in the same way. And so that helped actually maintain hope because we could sort of explain that from sense making. But there were some women who were not doing well who had done what they were supposed to do. They were good team players, like these 2 matriarchs, right? They did believe in the shared vision. When they did not make it through the program, that was much harder to make sense of. And so it started to call the hope culture's narrative into question, right? What is it that we're actually doing? Is what we're hoping for possible? And so the shared meanings were, hey, stick with us, do what we are suggesting is good for you, and buy into this positive, hopeful feeling and everything will be fine. But then there was also this sense of, well, if it could happen to these folks, could it happen to anyone? And then what are we doing? What do we really know about this? Do we really know what we're doing? So this was sort of an ambivalent time, and it unfolded over a long period of time where sort of fear and worry were catching on alongside some maintained positive emotions that were brought over from phase 1. So the organization over time was becoming slowly more irritable, exasperated. It felt a little more devoid of energy. There were more problems when I was going into the house. And at this point, they stopped their expansive future intentions and really decided to focus on their program, right? So it became very much like, okay, we got to figure out what's going on here, focus on the 4 walls. They basically ghosted the consultant and also decided to not pursue the idea of patents. And there were some informal conversations about, well, maybe what we're really doing is offering this temporary respite for women who have experienced trauma, and we're not able to say that we're providing this new life or new hope. So overall, this phase is called Harsh Realities Take Hold because the organization was starting to learn that the goals that they were hoping for were presenting some unanticipated challenges. And that was starting to pull on and cause questioning in whether or not their hopes were feasible. Okay, so phase 3 was a short phase but extremely meaningful. In phase 3, a very tragic event happened that sort of punctuated this downward decline. So things were sort of on the downswing, and then this happened and created its whole new own thing. So in order to understand why this was so important, I need you to understand a little bit about Lucy, who was a resident in the house who was just a beacon of hope. And it's hard sometimes even to talk about it because I knew her personally. And so it was extremely distressing. That's when I called Judy, actually, from the car. So she entered into the house with a lot of extreme trauma and mental health challenges, but she was always so happy to be there. And like, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to be in this program. And all I want is for people to tell me what to do to get better. Like, I'll follow the methods, I'll follow the practices. And like, she was constantly talking about the power of sticking with the program. So as she improved, she was like, it's the program that's keeping me alive, right? Like, sticking with the program is what's been important for me for changing around my life. She was also a cheerleader to other people in the house. Multiple people in the interviews referred to her as their best friend. So she was best friends with multiple people in the house. And she would always be good at like cheerleading people when they were down or starting to get off the path. And she really believed in the collective vision. So Lucy graduated from the program during the data collection, but she kept coming back. She got a job in a soup kitchen, helping people who were living on the street as she once had been, and so she felt very passionate about that. And she got an apartment. She painted the walls purple. She was very excited about that. She got a cat. His name is Tom. I've changed his name for the purpose of pseudonym as well. But she would come back. She would come back to the house and show residents who were in the program all these pictures. Like, look, this is what's possible if you stick it out, right? Like, you can do this too. I never thought this was possible for me, and now it is. And so maybe a week after I had seen her and she was showing me pictures of Tom in her apartment, we get word that she has died of a drug overdose. And it was horribly upsetting, and the organization just didn't know what to do. So members were verbally processing the tragedy among one another. But at this point is when we really saw the proto-narrative start to take hold. Well, hold on. If this program can't work in the long term for Lucy, who can it work for? And do we actually know what we're doing? And what is it that we are doing, right? And so it really created this sense of our concerns might be true, and maybe what we're saying is possible is not. And there was a very small sliver of like, there's some way we have to overcome this. So the shared meanings from that produced these contagious emotions that were pretty negative. And I remember walking in the door of the house and there was one of the staff members was crying and another staff member was consoling her. And she looked at me and she said, all we wanted to do was help these women, but it's so, so hard. And she was crying. And that was basically the mode that the organization operated in for a period of time. It was really exhausted. It felt really devoid of energy when I would go in. And at this point, informally, people were talking about maybe we should contract what we do or make what we do different. So this was obviously a phase where hopes had led to rock bottom because the hope culture's promises were not ringing true. So they were set up to believe that this was possible, and now in finding out that maybe it's not or questioning whether it is, they really got sent into a bad, negative space. Phase 4, interestingly, because I wasn't sure how they were going to move forward from there, a group of new residents came in to the organization, and they knew each other before from prison, actually. So they were friends, and they had strong social bonds like right away. So they came in and they were like, we want a different life. We're going to do whatever you say. We can do this together. We've got each other's backs. So it created this whole new energy that came into the house that sort of started to push out the negative energy. Also, 2 of the residents, the matriarchs who had left the house, we found out that they had committed to new programs, not at Light for the Future, but other programs, and were back on the road to recovery. And so that was a big boost for Light for the Future to think, well, maybe they didn't get it right with us, but maybe the reason they went to another program was because of what they got from our program, right? And so it started to create this sense of maybe we are doing something that's positive. So slowly, the narratives for the hope-filled side started to fill back up. Maybe there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We're in this together. Maybe we can do this. Maybe there will be successes moving forward. The proto-narratives were still there. There was still some uncertainty, but they were lessening, right? Because this new group of residents in the data, one of the staff says, this is a very good bunch, and she's like very excited about the new residents that came in. And so these more positive emotions started to take hold again. And while the sense of uncertainty was still present, there was this sense that, okay, we've gone through a really dark time, but maybe there's a light afterwards. So the organization became re-energized and more enthusiastic, and during this period of time, they started applying for new grants that they hadn't applied before. The board met, and they started to talk about, like, well, what is the future of this organization? Can we make changes to programming? What do we need to do to keep going? And most importantly, they added a second house, which provided aftercare services to women who had gone through the initial year of their program, which marked a major expansion of their programming. So this expansiveness of thinking about what they could do had returned. So overall, hope was slowly but surely returning during the Hope on the Rebound phase. Stepping back from our context and thinking about what this tells us about hope cultures in organizations tackling grand challenges is that they can be a double-edged sword. So trigger events happen, people make sense of them in light of the promises of the hope culture that we can do this. And that's all good when sense that's made is able to draw upon and reinforce those promises of the hope culture, and we have these hope-filled narratives and positive emotions, and the hope culture is strengthened, and the organization's alive, and they want to do more, right? But when they can't make sense drawing upon the promises of the hope culture, hopes are disappointed. Proto-narratives start to take over. Negative emotions spring forth, and the hope culture strength is weakened. And as a result, the organization becomes more exhausted, and they start to contract in on what they think is possible. So now I'm going to turn it over to Judy to wrap us up here on some future research directions.
Yes, Dan. All righty, folks. So I get the opportunity to bring this home. Katina and I and some co-authors, some of whom are in the audience, are taking this work the next step with our future research directions. So I think we were most intrigued with the idea that hope is not straightforward, that it involves this duality between hoping and despair and other kinds of negative emotions. So we're very much following up on that. I think you can read through the list, obviously, of all the different kinds of things that you might look at in the future if you're interested in this construct. But what I would like to say is, you know, when we were doing our research into hope, which was not the original intention of this study that we were doing, that was not the original focus, what we ran across was that hope is considered one of the 3 core pillars of positive organizational scholarship. It is meaningful, it's critical, it's important. We know a lot more about hoping at the individual level. We know very little in general about hope as a collective property of organizations and groups. And so I would like to just encourage people in the audience who have an interest in this topic to really take up the mantle and study this construct much more seriously, much more extensively. And there's so many opportunities, I think, to do that. Light for the Future is a very specific organization in a very particular circumstance. And so I think, obviously, you know, rolling out research that looks at other kinds of contexts and other kinds of ways would be a major advance. So I want to end with tying back to what Katina started with. One thing that really stood out to me over the years in working on this project was something that Katina shared with me. And what she shared with me was the weight on her shoulders of sharing this story with wider audiences. That what the women, some of the women who participated, some of the residents who participated in this study asked her to do was, if nothing else, get their story out to the world, because maybe that would make a difference. And so what I'd like to do is end with the quote, a quote from Lucy, who was had tragically died during this study. She says, "The pain you feel today will be the strength you feel tomorrow. For every challenge encountered, there is an opportunity for growth." So in alignment with her really wise words, we would like to encourage other scholars not just to study hope and other related constructs, but to do something meaningful with that work. And I will end there. Thank you, everybody.